Hey everybody, welcome into the Woody Hayes Athletic Center. Another Ohio State training camp practice in the books. It's time for some snap judgments. Snappy J's, as Berm might say.
I might say it, but I won't say it.
I
will say it wasn't just any old practice session.
I know. Let me get to that. That's Jeremy Birmingham, Bill Landis. I'm Austin Ward. It was an open practice, start to finish. There's no better kind for anybody breaking it down for the podcast especially. So we have a lot of observations to make, and they actually looked like real football, Bill.
Yeah, like last year we came out here for this day, and I think they were in shells. It was like overcast. I feel like they were just kind of like walking through some stuff. CJ Stroud didn't even practice. Like they had full pads on today. They had a pretty lengthy team period where they're actually playing real football. Some 7-on-7 stuff, some 11-on-11. Got to see some pass rush stuff, some inside drill. It was great. It was a real practice. Honestly, the first real practice we've gotten to watch in quite some time.
I was thinking about Big Ten Network, and that's why, of course, we got to watch the full thing today, is because they were here, and if they're here, they don't really feel good stopping us from watching the whole practice. If Big Ten Network gets to watch it. But think about a year ago when they were here, and they get here, and they're trying to figure out what the Ohio State Buckeyes are, and then CJ Stroud doesn't throw the football. Not once, didn't throw it one time. And so they're like, oh, what in the world? This week, we did get to see a team that looked complete. You know, I mentioned it to Austin, even though they're dealing with a couple injuries here and there at corner, nothing is long-term. This is about as healthy as I can remember the Buckeyes being at this point in a preseason in a long time. So it's fun to just get to watch these guys run around. Some thud tempo out here, guys that hooting and hollering when they make a play, and you know, a lot of competitive fire.
It is interesting that overall this team is incredibly healthy by training camp standards. Even a week into it, the pit is basically empty for Mickey Murray. Doesn't have to go rehab guys through injuries, but they are isolated at cornerback. And, you know, Cameron Brown is still on a pitch count. I think that's worth mentioning. They're trying to be careful and make sure that he's ready for September 3rd. We know it's Jordan Hancock. Does not appear to be anything major or long-term, but he's been out. Jansen Dunn, who was moved over to help fill out some of these reps in the short term, but he was limping a little bit and had to get some old treatment. Again, none of these things are likely to last very long, but it's certainly not fun for Ohio State.
Ryan Turner, another corner,
that they have all of that basically isolated at one position, which is a pretty important one if you're trying to stop the pass.
It's mildly alarming to look out during an 11-on-11 or a 7-on-7 and see guys at defensive line and linebacker and safety who you think are going to play, and then you look at a corner and Jake Seibert's out there. So, it's not great. The good news is, like you said, it's not long term. You want these guys ready for the opener. If they're not quite 100% now, I think that's okay. You did peek your head in here, and Jordan Hancock is not practicing fully, but he is moving around, he's doing stuff. So I think
there's no wrap.
That's
there's
encouraging.
No
they're still in their full pads. They're still moving around. They're just not taking part in full-on practice.
And again, if there was a game on Saturday, you'd fully expect Cameron Brown and Denzel Burke and J.K. Johnson to be your starting three. And I mentioned Austin during the practice. If things go poorly at corner, a guy like J.K. Johnson could be one of the most important players on this entire roster, just in the blink of an eye. And it does make you pay attention to the cornerback position. You look, okay, Cam Martinez is out there working on the outside, working at slot. J.K. Johnson, as I said. And then you have Lord McFarquhar, the walk-on.
His name is Lord.
What?
He's not the Shrek character.
This is news to me. You see Lord McFarquhar out there.
My Lord.
And, he made an interception against Kyle McCord and had the defense, clamoring for more of the Lord.
Need more Farquaad.
Need more Farquaad. And I just think it's one of those things where it's it kind of sucks that you don't have your full complement of guys out there, but at the same time, we're only 1 week into training camp, and maybe it doesn't hurt to have some other guys getting some opportunities to step up.
I thought J.K. Johnson handled his reps quite well from what we saw, and it was a good day for him. A lot of other Buckeyes caught the eye. I'm going to start with mine. The person who I thought was the MVP of the day was Emeka Egbuka. The guy is an incredible athlete. We knew that was the case. He's added some strength and muscle. We saw that a week ago in 4 periods of stretching, but he made a catch, and I had to ask you for help on the coverage. I missed it. I was it was great coverage by Tanner McAllister. He's draped all over Emeka Egbuka, and his body adjustment, reach in, contested catch, makes it deep downfield, and I was like, that looked like the kind of catch that Jackson Smith and Jigba would make last year. That caught my eye. He just got open consistently, didn't ever put a football on the ground. He he's on that upswing, and I thought that he was the most impressive player I saw today.
Yeah, he definitely flashed quite a few times. Marvin Harrison Jr. as well at that position. Jaden Ballard made a really nice kind of over-the-shoulder one-hand catch on a ball that I believe was thrown by Kyle McCord. I can't quite remember, but it was kind of like a slot fade deal, and Jaden sold his route really well and then made a really kind of acrobatic catch to do it. So not that anyone's surprised that looks like they have a bunch of dudes at receiver, but it's nice to watch a full practice and kind of get that confirmed for you.
And no pressure on Ibuka, but he's like the perfect blend. If you could take Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson and make them into one player.
Oh, yeah, no pressure.
No,
Wow.
that's
No
sort
pressure.
of who he is
Yeah.
at his peak, right? Like he is. I mean, no pressure.
Yeah.
But you can be as good as both those guys combined.
Just a mashup of 2 first-round draft
Right,
picks.
and he is that good. And I mean, I don't think we talk about him enough. He was the number 1 ranked receiver in the country in the class of 2021. He was not some throw-in. He was not a guy that this offseason should be ignored while we hype up Jackson Smith-Njigba and Marvin Harrison. Marvin Harrison's a freak. Everyone knows that. Jackson Smith-Njigba is maybe the best receiver in Ohio State history. But let's not forget that Emeka Ibuka was higher ranked than both of those guys coming out of high school.
He's sorry, I didn't mean to cut you
No,
off, but he's got some versatility to him too.
Yeah.
You can, I guess you can put Jackson kind of anywhere. You can put Emeka anywhere.
But Emeka is a deep threat. He is a guy that you can use in the swing game and the screen game and bubble screens, and he's a guy you can do on reverses. This is a kid that's going to find the football a lot. And I don't know necessarily that it means anything negative for Julian Fleming and other guys down the line, but like he's too good to keep out of the focus of the offense.
I felt like we would see Emeka working in the slot and allowing Jackson Smith-Njigba to go outside this year. That's sort of, in my mind, what I thought the top 3 would look like. That's not what we saw today. And it was Julian Fleming, at least with that first unit, and for just one period, Julian Fleming and Marvin Harrison on the outside, and Jackson staying inside in the slot. And I suppose that maybe that's just, he's so incredibly dangerous, and those other guys are good, and Emeka was working outside that you don't have to do that. You have the ultimate matchup nightmare by leaving Jackson in the slot. But I thought I wrote it down. I took notice of it. He doesn't mean he has to stay there for every single snap, but that's a little bit of what we saw more like in the Rose Bowl. I think this idea that was in Ryan Day's brain, like, well, what if we put him in the backfield, and what if we shift him around the formation?
Yeah.
Like, what are you gonna do?
He's the ultimate kind of chess piece, I think, and I guess maybe the closest comparison that this offense has had in recent memory is Curtis Samuel. They're not quite the same player. They're not really the same player at all. But I think they can do some of the same things. And with a guy like that, you hunt mismatches, and you don't want to peg him into only being an outside receiver because that's kind of the progression that Garrett Wilson had when he was a slot guy and he moved outside and he just kind of stayed out there. I think Jackson's got a little bit different of a skill set. He can do all those things outside. Like he can be a ball winner if you want to put him out there. But he's just so dynamic in the slot, and his route running is so deceptive. And honestly, too, the rapport that he has with C.J. Stroud in that middle area.
I said that today. Like, I don't think
important
Jackson Smith-Njigba should be allowed to practice.
Just put him in bubble wrap.
Yeah, I just think that
No. It wasn't to protect him. It was to protect the defense.
I think it does.
I thought it was unfair.
I think it's unfair and I also don't know that it helps the other quarterbacks. I don't know that it helps the other receivers. He's so good and so open all the time that the quarterbacks, he has to throw to him. He's so open every time, right? But is it actually helping the other guys? Is it? I mean, come on, America. Like, don't we want them to have their chance too? But honestly, I think the offense, it's such a funny spot because if you're going to have to double Jackson pretty much every time he's on the field. But then Marvin could also draw a lot of double teams just because of his size and the ability to do things on the outside. And if that opens up that other spot for Emeka Ibuka or Julian Fleming, you're going to have, I'm telling you could see a season statistically out of Emeka Ibuka that is going to shock people. Similar to what Jackson Smith-Njigba did last year when everyone thought you had to focus on Olave and Garrett Wilson. Yeah. But to me, I mean, we're still talking about who stood out today, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Who do you got?
Cade freaking Stover, man.
Cade freaking Stover.
Like, Cade Stover's a deep threat, apparently. He was the only receiver other than Xavier Johnson who I saw make a play down the field when they went to team stuff. Did it a couple times on a tight end wheel route. I mean,
that was nice.
It was stuff like that we're like, oh, that looks interesting. And we were talking to one of the defensive backs after practice, and he said, once the ball gets in Cade's hands,
one of them.
Yeah, wonder who it was.
Once the ball gets in Cade's hands, you can't get it out. And
come on, America, let's guess who it was.
It could have been anyone. But the point is, we haven't seen G. Scott really emerge into that secondary receiving option at tight end outside of Joe Royer. And it's Cade Stover and the ability to do multiple things, and obviously his physicality makes him different. maybe you see Kate Silver making himself a little money this year.
Yeah, that's a good observation. Bill, who gets your tribute today?
I mean, I have a few that I feel like I could name. This will shock nobody, but while 7-on-7 was happening, I went down to the other end of the field where offensive, defensive linemen were doing pass rushing drills, and a few guys stood out to me, mostly along the offensive line. I wasn't like Luke Whippler. I'm not sure he lost a rep. Had a little edge to him too. Got into a little scuffle there with Ty Hamilton. Nothing crazy.
A couple snap judgments favorites right there, going head to head. That caught the attention.
But really solid. I think the thing that stood out most to me was like watching that first offensive line group kind of go through all their first reps of pass rush. Frankly, like didn't look great. But then when they went through the second time, they all started to win. Paris Johnson, Donovan Jackson, Luke, Matt Jones, and DeJuan Jones all had really nice moments going against, Jack Sawyer, JT Tuimoloau, Zach Harrison, the guys that we think are going to be premier pass rushers this year. So I thought that was really encouraging to kind of see them fail, see them learn from their mistakes, have a really good second rep. Justin Fry was like really juiced up when he saw that, was giving guys high fives all over the place. So I guess I'll say the offensive line in general from that particular period. I don't know if we all felt like it was the strongest practice for them overall.
Right, but that's incredibly important, because when they did the inside drills just 10 minutes before that, when, again, the defense knew they were running the ball every play, the defensive line was sort of handing them their lunch.
They were, yeah.
And so you definitely are glad to see that offensive side of the ball come back and bow up.
That's why I wanted to at least let Ryan Day respond to that when we have an open practice like that, because I think we all watched that drill and thought the run defense is ahead of this rush offense at this point. Now, that drill is maybe stacked a little bit in favor of the defense for a couple reasons. An extra person in the box, there's no threat of a pass, and as Berm said, when you know it's coming, that makes it a lot easier as well. So obviously that makes it more difficult, but also we've spent the entire offseason talking about what does this Ohio State offense need to do? Well, you need to get 2 yards when everyone knows that you're going to run the football. So that period I don't think was great, but you also have to look at it from that camp perspective. Is it an encouraging sign that front seven group for the Ohio State defense was flying to the football and filling gaps and bringing the ball carrier near to the ground or thudding up the way they were? Like, they looked pretty impressive. I think that's the give and take of August. Like, somebody has to win a rep.
It's also something I said to Bill earlier. 95% of the games you play, you're not going to play against a defensive line that good. And so you have to maybe make some concessions.
Is there a game they're going to play with the defensive line better?
I mean, you get to the playoff and you might have to run into Clemson or Georgia.
Pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be, Michigan's going to have a good defensive line again, even without Hutchinson and Ajabo. And then if you get to the playoff, you're going to have to deal with Alabama or Clemson or Georgia or someone like that.
Okay.
I want to mention a player that stood out to me, because we talked so much a year ago about what we expected to see out of Zach Harrison a year ago. And we know he was this close all year long. And watching him today, he seemed to have a different gear than he did a year ago. And I don't know, maybe because we're not talking about him as much, people aren't paying attention. But I said on one of our shows a few weeks ago, I think he's going to lead the team in sacks this year. And I really liked what I saw out of him. He was a little bit lower to the ground, getting himself a little bit better in the matchup game, changing the where he's at. And you saw it against Paris Johnson a couple times. Like, he's getting around the edge, and if he can shorten that path to the quarterback by even a fraction, he's going to get a number of sacks that he was this close on last year.
Can I talk about Kai Stokes?
Sure you can.
This kid's an absolute dog. Like, I love watching him play football. He was great in the spring game, and even today, again, inside drill, like you said, tailored to the defense. It's a little easier to trigger downhill when you know the offense is going to throw the ball. But man, he has no hesitation to stick his head in there, get in the backfield. He was flying around making plays. I think the defense really feeds off the energy of a guy like that. So just felt like I needed to mention that he kind of stood out again in a practice setting where we got to watch him.
And I felt like one person that we hadn't talked enough about that also flashed to me on the defensive side of the football was Lathan Ransom. Mm-hmm. Again, I talked about him. The fact that he was able to practice was impressive enough, and the advances in modern medicine and all that stuff. But he looked like Lathan Ransom out there, and I think
he looks like 2020 Lathan Ransom.
Yeah, very, very athletic, nose for the football, aggressive, and I think that's why you can see, all right, well, what can we experiment with if you're Ohio State with Cameron Martinez and Jansen Dunn? Because I think Jim Knowles and Perry Eliano and Tim Walton are getting more out of Lathan Ransom than they could have reasonably expected. Jim Knowles alluded to that earlier in the week. He hadn't seen him. He hadn't worked with him in spring. He was missing all of that while recovering from the leg injury. Now it's like, oh, this guy is a legitimate option to play any of the safety spots and play it at a high level.
Yeah, I mean, he looks rebuilt.
Yeah.
And just to your point, I mean, Kai Stokes is a guy who we're talking about potential depth issues at corner. There was a lot of people in the Kai Stokes recruitment that thought he could eventually play corner because of his length and athleticism. And I wouldn't be surprised in a season like this where there's an issue at corner with depth. This kid's going to need to get on the field a little bit. So how do you find space for him? And he is that really exciting electric athlete. I was telling Austin out there, like, the idea next year of Sonny Styles and Kai Stokes in the safety at the safety spot together, it's like having a pair of Malik Hookers out there at the same time. And that is...
Hey, no pressure to everybody that just has to go out and be a hybrid of Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson.
He doesn't have to. He just
two
is.
Malik Hookers in the secondary.
And I also was really impressed by what we saw out of Jair Brown. He was the second... it was the first true freshman to lose his black stripe in this camp. He's a kid that was out here, I mean, getting physical. He threw Marvin Harrison to the ground on a rep. And, I mean, he's a competitive kid, and he may not be the athlete that everyone looked at in the recruiting class. Like, oh, this guy's going to be a dude. But, like, Jair is he's got a little bit of an edge to him.
He's got a little Denzel Burke.
He's got a little edge to him that you like to see out of that corner spot. And I think if you put Kai and Jair and Sonny, and then you start to work in J.K. Johnson, all of a sudden you don't just have some really good athletes. You got guys with a absolutely different mentality than we maybe have seen it in the defensive back.
You've got a Ruger.
You got a whole bunch of stuff going on there. That is a smorgasbord.
All right. Anything else that we need to mention on Snappy J?
CJ Stroud's pretty good.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
I think it's important to mention that. Like, he was doing things that you don't like.
Okay, tell him about the throw, Berm. Tell him about it.
He just throws the ball into spots where you're looking at it, you go, don't throw that ball.
There, yeah.
And then, but then somehow he decides, I'm going to throw it anyway. But then it gets through three defensive backs and it lands in Caleb Brown's hands. You're like, how did that happen?
Yeah.
And then the very next rep, you see Kyle McCord have to step up and go, okay, now I got to do something. And try to force a throw, and it gets picked off by Lord McFarquhar. Right? And so you're like, well, I mean,
sneaky
I just think it's important. That's, I guess, the point I'm trying to make here is that it's important for everyone to be themselves. Like, Kyle McCord is a gunslinger mentality, and I think that he needs to understand if he wants to be that guy next year and be the guy that takes the reps after CJ when the Buckeyes are winning by 40 points in the second quarter this year.
Yeah.
Like, he needs to go out there and take care of the football. Because right now, he may not be able to do the things or see the field the way CJ does. That's not to say he won't ever, but CJ certainly gets the reps to do that. And boy, oh boy, he's really good at it.
CJ a couple times kind of got out of the pocket and like on designed rollouts, and I thought threw the ball well, which I think he did not always do well last year. Probably like
tended to sail it a little
kind
bit
of a weakness of his, I think, and an area where he can grow. So that was nice to see. And then one other thing I want to point out on the defensive side. They were on the far end of the field from us, and they had a defensive lineup out there where they had their two deep safeties. Actually, I think it was three deep safeties, and Court Williams was still in there, lined up more like a linebacker, which is interesting because, as Jim Knowles talked about earlier this week, we kind of discussed a lot about, are they going to play like a Sam linebacker when they play the Notre Dames and Wisconsins of the world? And Jim Knowles said, well, we have a guy like Court Williams might be able to do some of that while helping us maintain our defensive structure. And we saw a little glimpse of that today, which was interesting.
Almost looked like hybrid.
Like a hybrid safety
type.
linebacker. Yeah. Oh, that's a good name for it.
We should call it that.
Yeah.
I mean, in a safety-driven defense, you need to have a safety that steps up. You also need to have young linebackers that are able to be the guys next year. And this is my last point. I know people love C.J. Hicks.
Yeah.
So in this practice, which was bizarrely short,
very short
for the veterans, they were done in an hour. But they got a big scrimmage on Saturday, saving the body a little bit. They had the young guys, the true freshmen, the non-black stripe removed guys out there, and CJ Hicks made a really nice over-the-shoulder interception that he, in a game, probably would have returned to the house. And you really get a chance to see the glimpse of that athleticism that he's got. And at 6'4", 220, like he looks like. We don't see a lot of the traditional Ohio State linebackers anymore out there, like the Bobby Carpenters, the Andy Katzenmoyer types.
There's no Schlags out there.
CJ Hicks looks like that guy. I almost called him CJ Hawk.
Just putting big time expectations on every young
There you
player in
go.
the program.
Just come be
I just feel like
players in
everyone loves
sports.
hyperbole, and I think we need to give it to the people.
Everyone loves it.
Everyone loves hyperbole.
Okay.
Everyone loves hyperbole more than anything in the world.
That's what I was hoping you would say. That's Snap Judgment, Snappy Jays. Another one in the books, but it's the best one because it's an open practice. Can't believe we got a full hour and 15 minutes of exposure to this team. We're going to milk it for the rest of the month. That's Bill Landis. Berm, I'm Austin. Thanks for joining us on the podcast. We'll be back for more coverage with the podcast daily tomorrow morning. Stay with us for full coverage of the Ohio State Buckeyes.